Brett, thank you so much for the invitation to come and being with the Miller Street Church of Christ. It's a great honor and privilege to be here, and I am appreciative of the opportunity to come and preach the gospel this evening. Though I feel like it should be Wednesday night, but it is Tuesday night, and as soon as I wrap my mind around that, I'll get started. You may notice when I talk, I will sound a little different than many of you. I grew up in Nova Scotia, Canada, and so I'm going to pronounce my oat in a boat, or we should go to Outback Steakhouse. That's going to be a little odd to you, and then you're going to be confused because you're going to sit back and think, how come he sounds like a Southerner as well? He sounds like a Canadian. He sounds like he's from Tennessee. How did that happen? I was in Tennessee for about 6 years, and I picked up a little Southern drawl. I like to consider my accent now the labradoodle of accents, the perfect combination between Southern and Canadian. It's a rare breed, but I have perfected it. Two storekeepers were at each other's throats constantly. They would watch each day for customers that would come in, and any day that they had a customer that went to their store instead of their rivals, they would rejoice. They would have this smug smirk on their face as they would stare at the other shopkeeper's place. They would sit there each day taking tally of how much business they had, but they really rejoiced when they could steal the other customer or the other company's business. One day, though, during the night, an angel came to one of the shopkeepers, and the angel said, I want to grant you a wish, anything you want, but I want you to know whatever you wish for, I'm going to give your rival shopkeeper double. Twice what I give you. But you can be rich, very rich as you could ever dream possible. But just know, however rich you are, your rival will be twice as rich. He says you can have a long life and great health. But just know, whatever I give you, he is going to get twice as much. The shopkeeper pondered, and he kind of had a sad look. And he looked at the angel and he says, I wish that you strike me blind in one eye. Jealousy can blind us to who we are. We can allow jealousy to so cause us to see the other person, to see somebody else, that we want them hurt so much that we're willing to even hurt ourselves. That jealousy comes into our hearts and corrupts us. Now, years ago, jealousy during the time of David and Saul and Jonathan was usually solved by spears. Usually it was solved through warfare, but not today. We don't do that today. We're much more civilized in America. We now allow jealousy to filter into the social media atmosphere. We throw shade at one another. We're passive aggressive. We block people because we just can't stand seeing that person prosper anymore. And so we're not as violent as David or Saul was, but we now use little subtle digs at each other, little comments of praise that really is meant to hurt, because we can struggle with jealousy just as much as they did. It may look different, but the heart can be just as full of jealousy in the 21st century as it was back when David was living. Jealousy can overtake you. It can corrupt you. And then everything you see, that relationship with that person, you filter it all through jealousy. And it ends up destroying your heart. And so we're going to talk about David. I believe that's our theme kind of this year for the gospel meeting. And I believe I get to kick this off. And so I didn't have to worry about what anybody else is going to talk about. I just picked my topic. And then if somebody else jumps in on it, well, they'll do a better job anyway, and you'll be blessed. So I want to talk about David, but when we talk about David, sometimes we have this standard. And we look to David and we think, there's just no way that I can be a man after God's own heart. And then you look at his sin and you think, well, that's a horrendous sin, but that's not where I'm struggling right now. So I decided when we look at David, maybe we should look at Saul. We can look at Saul. Now that's a man that has some flaws. That's a person that maybe some of us can relate to. And he struggled with jealousy. So let's look at about 3 ways that we see jealousy corrupting us. 3 ways that jealousy corrupts us. And the first way that jealousy corrupts us is self-centered shade throwing. Now this term shade you may not be familiar with. It comes from the teenage world. And most things from the teenage world, we don't know what it means anyway. So I had to look it up in the dictionary. Really it meant, I looked it up on Google. And it means that it's when you give an insult on social media, it means that you're throwing shade on somebody. Look how Saul throws the first spear of shade at David. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7 to 11. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. What more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Now, you're going to read this section here, and you probably will get stuck on something and wonder, how did God give him this harmful spirit? How did this harmful spirit rush upon him? And you're going to get stuck there and you're going to think, I want that explained. But that's not the point of the sermon. And so we're not going to explain it. We're just going to keep on going. And then say, that's your homework. And we're going to let Mark Johnson preach his lesson on that when he comes, or Tom Walker. I know one of these other preachers in the audience will certainly explain it much better than I will. But I don't want to focus on that tonight. So let's go back to the topic of jealousy. Notice what happens here. David is a mighty warrior for God. He is killing thousands of these Philistines. And Saul is so insecure that he doesn't realize that David is killing his enemy. That Saul is so insecure that he doesn't realize that David is on his own team. It's not that David is fighting against Saul. It's not that David is trying to take the kingdom. David is submissive to the king. He is fighting for Saul. He is on Saul's side. But because Saul is so corrupted with jealousy, he can't stand somebody else getting praised. You know that you are struggling with jealousy when somebody else is being praised and you don't like it. You know there's a little bit of that harmful spirit of jealousy when somebody else is being praised for good work that you support, but in your heart you just don't like it. Saul is so infatuated with his ego that he can't take somebody else doing good things. He can't take somebody else getting the praise. It's not that David is trying to overtake him. Saul is just upset because David is getting a little more praise. It's not that Saul's a bad guy here. It's not that Saul is not a mighty warrior himself. It's that David is just getting the praise right then and there. He becomes infatuated with his jealousy. Reminds me of when my daughter was playing tennis. And we were there at Bison in Castle Rock, and my daughter and her partner in tennis were getting killed. It was the first set, and if you know anything about tennis, it goes to 6. Well, Gabrielle and her partner in that first set, they were 0-6. They lost bad, and it wasn't even that close. Fortunately, tennis only goes to 6. You can only get 6 beatdowns at one time in one set. But then, the next set, our girls started playing better. During the first set, I would cheer for Gabrielle. Good job, honey. Good job, little wooksters. That's what I call her. I know that's odd. When you have dyslexia, you just make stuff up and think they're words. And so I'm cheering her. I'm saying, good shot, good shot. I'm cheering for the other team because, well, there's not much to cheer for on my team. I'm just trying to be a good sport about this. But then, when our girls started doing better, I don't know about you, but I'm sure football moms are bad, soccer moms are bad. I don't know about volleyball, but I'll tell you, tennis moms, they can be scary. And this mom started losing it. I can't believe you're cheering. You're hurting my daughter's feelings. And I'm sitting here thinking, can your daughter not take a little bit of losing? You were fine when we were cheering, when my daughter was getting killed, and you were cheering as well for your daughter. But then all of a sudden, when the score starts to change, you're mad that our daughter is getting cheered for. And you're worried that your daughter's feelings may get hurt. Welcome to reality. But that's how competitive we get. That's how we get jealous. We can't stand somebody else doing well. When that spirit happens, that's called jealousy. Let's look at the second way that we see jealousy corrupting our hearts. It's when we throw passive-aggressive shade. Passive-aggressive shade. Now look at what happens here. Now Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then, become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servant spoke those words in the ears of David. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? And the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Now notice what happens here. Saul uses passive-aggressive tactics to ensnare David. Now this looks like such a favor, such an honor. You're going to come and marry the daughter of the king. You're going to be invited into the kingdom. You're going to be part of the kingly family. And David is sitting back thinking, wow, who am I to have such an honor to be part of Saul's family? But the whole time, This is just Saul trying to manipulate David. Sometimes when people are kind, it doesn't mean they're kind people. Sometimes people will use kindness to manipulate you. You may get a pie baked for you, maybe in the meaning of kindness, but there's a whole bunch of jealousy in those apples. We will use kind compliments. We will praise people. But if our heart is jealous of that person, we're using it to somehow secure favor. Sometimes we do it to try to throw up a smoke screen because we don't want to let them know what's really in our hearts. And so Saul here is faking kindness so he can get David to get the bride price and go and then get himself killed by trying to kill these Philistines. This is all passive, aggressive spear throwing. It may look nice, it may seem nice, but it's all Saul in his jealousy, and it's rooted in hatred. It's amazing that sometimes a gift is full of jealousy, not kindness. But look at David's approach. Look at 23. And David said, "Does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation?" Now notice Saul. The reason Saul's so jealous is because he considered his reputation to be preeminent. I am Saul. I am great. I am wonderful. And his reputation is so insecure, and he has to make sure that he's better than everybody else. That's why he feels like his jealousy gets provoked, because his insecurity is infringing upon him. But David, in response, he sits back and thinks, who am I? I'm a poor man. I have no reputation. If you notice yourself becoming jealous quite often, think about how much you consider your reputation to be important. A lot of times people become jealous because they're worried about somebody else having a greater reputation, greater talents, that you think too highly of yourself. But notice that that's not the Spirit of Christ. Look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 7 to 9. It says this, "But emptied himself, Jesus Christ, by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name." Now, in this section here, this is the ESV, but in the King James Version, this idea, it says that he has no reputation. Jesus Christ wasn't jealous. He wasn't angry. He didn't worry about other people being praised. It's because he never worried about his reputation. He never considered his reputation so fragile that he had to protect it. But when jealousy gets into your heart, the next thing you know, you are trying to keep everybody else down because you're worried about losing your position or preeminence. Jealousy is about you protecting something that is not of God. What is of God is humility, lowliness, thinking not highly of yourself, but considering others more important than yourself. But when we allow jealousy to overtake us, this is what happens. We fall into the mind traps of jealousy. Personalizing is the first one. It's this. You start to mind read. Well, I know why they cooked that pie for me. It's because they were just trying to make up for being mean. You don't know that. You're just making stuff up in your head. But when you start personalizing and you believe that everything's about you, that you think that that person is acting that way, or they're talking to that person, or they sent out that prayer request, it's because they're trying to get at you, they're trying to dig at you, and you think all that person is sitting back thinking about you. The reality of it is they don't care about you that much. They're not thinking about you. They're too busy thinking about themselves. That's human nature. But when you start thinking jealous thoughts, you start thinking that that person's whole day is about what you're doing. They don't care about what you're doing. But when you start allowing jealousy to take over, you start personalizing. The next thing you start to do is fortune telling. Something comes up, you're like, I know what they're going to do. I bet they're going to go talk to this person and tell them this. Oh, I bet they're going to go and have this ministry at church, and they're just doing it to try to get praise. You don't know that. You can't predict the future. But the next thing you know, when you're a jealous person and that jealousy is directed towards somebody else, all of a sudden you become a prophet of them. It's like you know exactly what they're going to do, when they're going to do it. That's because you're getting trapped in jealousy. And then the last one is mind reading. You know their motivation. They called Sister Mary because she was in the hospital. And you say, well, they were just doing that to suck up. You don't know that. They probably called Sister Mary because she was sick. But when you start mind reading, thinking that you know what that person's motivations are, why they're doing what they're doing, like somehow you have a window into their mind and you know everything about them. You don't know anything about them. But that's the mind traps of jealousy. The last one about how jealousy corrupts us is alliance shade. Alliance shade. Look at what happens here. 1 Samuel 19, 1-4. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore, be on your guard. In the morning, stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are. And I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you. And Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you. Notice what happens here, this alliance shade. When there's jealousy in a system, people try to get other people aligned with them. They want to get people on their side against somebody else. And so you always know when there's some jealousy because you are going to have somebody talk about somebody else, and it's usually going to be this story. There will be a victim, there will be a villain, and your job is to help the victim. It's always, poor me, I have been done wrong, and that big, bad, evil, meanie person who doesn't like Christ is hurting me. And they're trying to get you pulled into their jealousy, pulled into their conflict. Jonathan is getting pulled in by Saul, and Jonathan's like, Dad, what's your problem? He hasn't done anything to you. Notice how mature Jonathan is. Jonathan says, I don't see what the problem is. He hasn't hurt you. He is my friend. I am not going to be disloyal to him in your presence and then go be nice to David. He is honest in his dealings. So one of the best ways that you can help somebody with jealousy when they come to you and they bring this alliance shade is to speak well of the other person. But be careful. Don't speak too well. You're just going to make it worse. But say, when they have this mind reading, fortune telling, personalizing, try to lower the intensity of it. Try to say, are you sure that that's their motivation? Are you sure that that's what they're going to do in the future? Are you sure that that was about you? Be like Jonathan and try to diffuse the jealousy when somebody else starts to throw shade at another person. But that's what Saul does here. Saul is so worried about David that he's so enamored with him that he tries to get his son involved into the plan to kill him. When people have jealousy, they will do everything they possibly can to try to get you to side with them. And if they're asking you to side with them, there's usually a heart condition that needs help. Reminds me of the story of these two deacons, and you always know the deacons can get fighting sometimes. And so these two deacons were kind of at each other. They were at each other for years. And so one day, this one deacon goes up to the other deacon and says, I heard you give that devotional last night, and I want to let you know, I heard that devotional 14 years ago. You gave that same devotional 14 years ago. Well, the other deacon, kind of annoyed, says, well, I heard you 3 weeks ago, and I can't remember a word you said. When you start allowing jealousy to get into your heart, all it does is hurt you most. It doesn't hurt the other person. And if you look at Saul's life, he needed to sheath that spear, because the spears he was throwing at David didn't hurt David. The spear of jealousy ultimately killed Saul. Jealousy kills every time. The solution to jealousy is to know you're loved by God. You don't have to worry about your reputation. You don't have to worry about your preeminence. You get to be in a relationship with God, and He loves you and He gives you your worth. That's why Jesus Christ came to earth to die for our sins. Jesus, who had considered himself to of no reputation, was willing of one person who had a reputation, the Son of God, heavenly being, God Himself. If God did not worry about His reputation, we should not as well. And He was willing to come to earth because He did not concern Himself with His reputation, willing to die for our sins. And we respond to that if we will believe, confess, repent, and be baptized for the remission of our sins. Maybe the invitation is this as well. Think about, are you allowing jealousy into your heart? Are you allowing jealousy at work, in your home, in your families, in your churches? Whatever is happening, if there's even a speck of jealousy, stomp it out before the jealousy stomps you out. Thank you so much for your time. Why don't you stand and sing as we sing.